Welcome to this webinar on the Program Components and Practice Framework of Community Response in Wisconsin. The webinar is sponsored by the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board. My name is Kristen Slack from the School of Social Work and the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This presentation was developed in collaboration with my colleague, Lawrence Berger. The presentation will cover 4 topics, including the history of the Community Response Program in Wisconsin, CRP Program Components, the CRP Practice Framework, and a brief discussion of the intended outcomes of community response. First, we'll start with a history of Wisconsin's Community Response Program. Several factors coalesced in the mid-2000s to motivate the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board to solicit proposals for community response programs. First, there was a recognition that families diverted at the front end of CPS, those families whose reports were screened out or whose initial assessments did not result in a CPS case opening, actually represented the largest population to touch the Child Protective Services system. There was also research evidence emerging that families whose maltreatment allegations were unsubstantiated when followed over time had similar re-report rates to families whose maltreatment allegations were substantiated. Such findings suggested that families diverted from CPS faced an elevated risk of being re-reported to the system, yet very few systematic efforts to engage and work with this population existed in the U.S. at the time. All of the above factors were recognized by the Prevention Board as well as the State Department of Children and Families. While the Prevention Board spearheaded the effort to establish community response, the initiative would not have been possible without the support and buy-in from DCF. The goals of Wisconsin's Community Response Program include the establishment of comprehensive voluntary services for families diverted from CPS, to help build a more comprehensive community-based service continuum to strengthen families at risk for child maltreatment, to prevent re-reports to CPS by reducing risk factors and building protective factors related to child maltreatment, and to reduce demands on the CPS system by reaching families early and meeting their needs before a crisis occurs. In considering the first goal of the Community Response Initiative, to enhance voluntary service options for families diverted from CPS, it is useful to think of a continuum of child maltreatment prevention services reflecting the voluntary or involuntary nature of the service. The most common type of child maltreatment prevention service is voluntary, community-based, and designed to address the needs of the family as a whole. There are variations on this model, but some common examples include home visiting programs, family resource centers, and parenting support groups. Because of the voluntary nature of these programs, they typically involve client families who have initiated help seeking on their own, although many family support programs also actively recruit clients or rely upon referrals from other agencies and services. These programs most often operate entirely outside of the formal child protection system. On the far right side of the continuum is traditional child protective services. If a family is reported to CPS, screened in, investigated, and found to be in need of ongoing services, CPS can open a case and require families to participate in a variety of services. Prevention of future maltreatment remains a goal, but it is a tertiary or indicated form of prevention and often involves more intensive, longer-term, involuntary services. In more recent years, many states and localities have implemented alternative response programs, also called differential response. These programs evolved in response to recognition that many families entering the CPS system have less severe needs, better served by working with families in a more collaborative manner, and with fewer to no mandated requirements. Most alternative response programs are still delivered within the CPS system, and there are mechanisms in place to step up the intensity of services to a more traditional CPS approach. Community response is intended to fill a gap in the prevention service continuum. That gap involves families who touch the CPS system but who are diverted because their circumstances do not meet statutory definitions of maltreatment. This group may be offered ad hoc referrals to community services when they are diverted from CPS at the report or initial assessment stage, but often they receive little to no further assistance. Wisconsin's Community Response Program is an effort to fill this gap in the prevention service continuum. In considering the second goal of community response, to help build a more comprehensive service continuum to strengthen families at risk for child maltreatment, it is critical to consider how the programs depicted in this slide interact and coordinate with each other and with other aspects of a family's environment. First is the recognition that families may move up and down and in and out of various prevention services over time. To best serve families, it is helpful to have mechanisms established that allow for information sharing across agencies and programs. Such mechanisms must ensure that sensitive information is sufficiently protected. The ability to communicate and coordinate with other systems with which families are involved, such as systems providing mental health services and economic support, is also necessary to ensure that families do not face conflicting service requirements and to reduce duplicative services. Prevention programs all along the continuum need to work on building relationships with staff from these external systems to facilitate families' access to needed information and resources. Other service systems in which families regularly participate on a larger scale involve schools, healthcare, and childcare. Similar communication and coordination channels should exist with these systems on an as-needed basis and with the full knowledge and consent of families. Finally, families have ties to a host of informal networks that can serve as sources of strength and support. When families request, these informal ties should be recognized and called upon as part of a sustainable prevention infrastructure. Although the goals of community response pertaining to the expansion of a continuum of prevention services are laudable, it was not known at the outset whether community response was a feasible service model that families would want to access voluntarily. The initial 6 sites funded by the Prevention Board participated in an implementation evaluation. This evaluation allowed the Prevention Board and site teams to learn whether and the extent to which families would participate in the program, the types of needs these families expressed, and their progress once enrolled. It also allowed sites time to work through the initial stages of coordinating referrals from county CPS agencies. Given the novelty of working on a larger scale with families diverted from CPS, there were also issues and concerns that had to be addressed related to information sharing, child safety, and how best to conduct outreach with the intended service population. From the implementation evaluation, several key findings emerged. First, the program acceptance rate by families ranged from 28% to 83% across sites, with an overall acceptance rate of about half. This exceeded the expectations of many of the program stakeholders. Second, sites that focused on families diverted from CPS at the initial assessment stage tended to have higher participation rates than sites focusing on families screened out at the report stage. This made sense, given that families screened out at the report stage often had less accurate contact information. They also had no knowledge that maltreatment allegations had been reported on their families in many cases, and many declined services out of concern that involvement in community response would lead to more unwanted surveillance. When sites received their referrals from Child Protective Services staff, the CPS worker provided a referral reason, and these were most often related to parenting concerns. During the intake and assessment phase for families engaged in community response, parents and caregivers most often prioritized needs that were economic in nature, although parenting needs were still quite prevalent, as were needs related to caregiver and child well-being. Given the intended voluntary nature of community response, it was important to have insight about the needs that families self-identified. The implementation evaluation also found that families referred to CRP had very low levels of income overall. But despite this low income, participant reports of means-tested public benefits receipt was low, suggesting that families eligible for these benefits were not always accessing them. Families with an income-related service goal, such as needing assistance with housing, job seeking, or accessing public benefit systems, were more likely to attain their self-defined service goals. Overall, nearly 3/4 of CRP participants were assessed by CRP staff to have made significant progress toward at least one of their service goals, and 57% were found to have attained at least one of these goals. The next slide provides an overview of the Community Response Program components. There are several components of the CRP that set the parameters for participant eligibility and resource allocation. CRP is intended to serve families whose circumstances have brought them to the attention of the child protection system, but who have not traditionally been served by this system. In its present form, Wisconsin's Community Response Program focuses on families screened out at the report stage or whose cases are closed at initial assessment. There are a few additional eligibility criteria for CRP. Families must have at least one minor age child, sufficient contact information for the CRP outreach process, and they must reside in the state of Wisconsin. The Community Response Program is intended to be relatively short in duration, 12 to 16 weeks. Community response is intended to help families initiate the process of accessing needed resources and develop a strategy for achieving shorter-term goals. Families are able to reconnect with the program after their service period ends, but these reconnections are also intended to be brief. In addition to the logistical program components, community response is informed by several practice approaches and principles. The next few slides review each of these frameworks. The CRP intervention is intended to address a broad array of strengths and service needs associated with multiple levels of and systems within each client's environment. This approach is heavily rooted in one of the most prevalent theories underpinning our understanding of the causes and consequences of child maltreatment, ecological systems theory. This theory was first articulated in the 1970s by developmental psychologist Uri Bronfenbrenner for understanding human development in general. However, over the years, researchers studying child maltreatment and practitioners intervening with families at risk for maltreatment have embraced this framework, no doubt in part because it validates the complexity of the phenomenon of child abuse and neglect. A second theoretical framework central to community response is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, published by psychologist Abraham Maslow as a theory of human motivation. Maslow argued that the first level of need, physiological needs, had to be met in order for an individual to focus on higher order levels of need. Informed by this framework, CRP recognizes the importance of basic needs such as food, shelter, transportation, clothing, and medical care as a source of family stress and a critical early intervention point. Findings from the CRP implementation phase demonstrated a high degree of need related to economic issues and high levels of poverty and economic stress overall. CRP staff work with families to address economic needs, helping families navigate public benefit systems and community resources, and where necessary, using program flex funds for families in economic crisis. The Community Response Program is also guided by the Protective Factors Framework promoted by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. The CRP aims to strengthen families in 5 main areas: parental resilience, social connections, concrete support in times of need, knowledge of parenting and child development, and social emotional competence of children. CRP follows this framework by connecting families to economic assistance, community organizations and resources that may promote caregiver resilience and family social connections, and by working with both caregivers and children to help them access resources and develop the skills they need to thrive. An important foundation of the Community Response Program is an orientation to strengths-based practice. This term evolved as a reaction to the more ubiquitous deficits or problem-focused approaches to client intervention. Family support agencies commonly aspire to be strengths-based, but how this gets operationalized in practice is not always clear or consistent. There have been various iterations of a strengths perspective over the decades, but strengths-based practice as it applies to the profession of social work was put forth in the 1980s by faculty of the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare. It is captured by 6 practice principles, including the belief that all individuals, groups, families, and communities have strengths, an understanding that the adversities experienced by clients can be viewed as opportunities to promote resilience and strength, a belief that every person has the capacity to overcome challenges, grow, and change, that clients are best served when we work alongside of them rather than from a position of power and authority, a recognition that every community and environment has resources to tap into, and that the context of helping and caretaking is important to consider and optimal if it is within a naturally occurring setting. The CRP, the Community Response Program, borrows from the social work strengths-based practice perspective in several ways. First, the intervention is client-centered. Each client has a unique service plan tailored to his or her own strengths, needs, and service preferences. Home visits are encouraged in order to meet clients in their comfort zone. The intervention is highly collaborative. Each client identifies and prioritizes his or her own service needs. The CRP worker communicates observed strengths and needs, but works collaboratively with clients to support client-directed decision-making around service plans. The intervention is also meant to be empowering. The CRP intervention is focused on helping clients articulate their own strengths and needs and self-direct a plan for achieving select short-term goals. This approach supports self-determination, a key tenet of the strengths-based perspective. Program activities such as needs assessments and program goal setting emphasize families' and communities' strengths. This self-identification of strengths also aligns with the strengths-based practice perspective. Participation in CRP is entirely voluntary, which puts the power in the hands of the client to engage in services. Although clients are referred to community response after a contact with CPS, the CRP intervention is external to and separate from CPS. It is not informed by the CPS event. This removes any perception by clients that the CRP worker holds more power or authority in the client relationship. Finally, CRP staff advocate for and with their clients to obtain access to services and resources sought by clients. This process actually embodies all 3 CRP strengths-based principles. A final practice component of the Community Response Program is evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice requires a strong knowledge of evidence-based interventions relevant to a presenting set of needs, so that program staff can communicate this evidence base to clients. Program staff should also explain to clients what resources their particular agency has to offer, as well as the resources available in the larger community. Clients can then weigh in on what makes the most sense for themselves or their families, given their unique characteristics and preferences. As their needs change, this process may continue, always informed by the evidence base of available services and programs. Revisiting the stated goals of the Community Response Program, now 10 years after its inception, we are able to say that we have come a long way in achieving the first 2. Numerous counties around the state have implemented community response, and the availability of this program serves to fill a needed gap in the prevention services continuum. In the coming years, identifying funding streams and infrastructure to expand community response to more counties will be critical. The third goal of community response, to prevent re-reports to CPS, has not yet been rigorously evaluated, although an evaluation is underway. The goal is to understand whether the Community Response Program is a more effective alternative to the status quo of service delivery for families diverted from CPS. To the extent that we can build evidence that community response reduces re-reports to CPS, and also provides county CPS agencies with a viable and sustainable referral resource for families whose needs do not rise to the level of ongoing CPS services, the fourth goal can also be addressed. As this next phase of community response is implemented, we will learn how well these four goals have been achieved in our efforts to strengthen families at risk for child maltreatment. This slide offers several references for work cited in the presentation. Please contact Rebecca Murray at the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board if you would like more information about community response.